In this passage, historians remain divided over the role of banks in facilitating economic growth of United States in the late 18th and earlier 19th centuries. So when you see they remain divided, that means there must be two opposing viewpoints. Let's see. Some scholars contend that banks played a minor role. Nation's growing economy, financial institutions, they argue, appeared only after the economy had begun to develop and once organized, follow conservative lending practices, providing aid to established commercial enterprises, but shunning those such as manufacturing and transportation projects that were more uncertain and capital intensive. So this is one view. Now if you see in contrast, so there's another group of historians. They argue that banks were crucial in transforming the early national economy. When state legislators began granting more bank charters in 1790s and early 1800s, the supply of credit rose accordingly. Unlike the earliest banks, which had primarily provided short-term loans to well-connected merchants, the bank of early 19th century issued credit wisely. So this is the opposing view. Now if you see Gilley asserts the expansion and democratization of credit in the early 19th century became the driving force of the American economy, as banks began furnishing large amounts of capital for transportation and industrial enterprises, which was missing earlier. The exception, such historians argue, was in the South, where the overwhelmingly agrarian nature of the economy generated outright opposition to banks, which were seen as monopolistic institutions controlled by an elite group of planters. So the author is presenting two opposing views in terms of what was the bank's role in the American economy, in developing American economy in late 18th and early 19th centuries. The primary purpose of the passage is that's the primary purpose of the passage actually. Compare the economic role played by the southern banks with the economic role played by the banks in the rest. No, that's not the primary purpose, to compare southern versus others. Re-evaluate a conventional interpretation. Again, there is no conventional interpretation given here. Present different interpretation of the roles played by the banks in American economy during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That's what it presents actually. Analyze how the increasing number of banks in the late 18th and early 19th centuries affected the American economy. So it's not analyzing, it's just presenting others' views. Okay, the author is not presenting his views. If he would be presenting the things, then it would be an analysis. Examine how scholarly opinion regarding the role played by the banks in the American economy during the late 18th and early 19th centuries has changed over. It's not talking that earlier it was the view and now it is changed to this thing. That's not what it is doing. The passage suggests that the scholars mention in the line 4, some scholars contend that banks played a minor role in nation's growing economy. They tended not to fund manufacturing and transportation projects. The reason why they were not funding transportation and manufacturing projects was what? Now, if you see financial institutions, they argued, appeared only after the economy had begun to develop and once organized, followed conservative lending practices. Conservative means not doing anything new or not taking any risk. Okay, that's what conservative means. So let's see which option tells me that. So these projects being well established and well capitalized, wrong. These projects entailed a level of risk that was too great for banks' conservative lending practices. Yes, that's what it says. Okay, it simply says the lending practices were conservative and it was the reason why they were not funding such industries. Now if you see other options, banks prefer to invest in other more speculative projects. It doesn't say that thing. Bank managers believe that those projects would be unlikely to contribute significantly. It doesn't tell me that thing. Bank managers believing funding these projects would result in credit being extended. Wrong. Third, the passage suggests that Paul Gilly would be most likely to agree with which of the following claims about the lending practices of earliest banks. Now, if we see, it mentioned earlier banks. Unlike the earliest banks, which had primarily provided short-term loans to well-connected merchants. So, these lending practices were unlikely to generate substantial profit out. These lending practices only benefited a narrow sector of the economy. That's what it says. Other options, the restrictive nature of these lending practices generated significant opposition. I mean, that particular line doesn't tell me that thing. The restrictive nature of these lending practices forced state legislature, again, it's mentioned in some other part of the passage, not in that line. These lending practices were likely to be criticized, again, not mentioned in that line. The passage suggests that opposition to banks in the South in the early 19th century stemmed in part from the perception that banks, if you see, the banks were seen as monopolistic institutions controlled by an elite group of planters. That was the perception. So, did not benefit more than a small minority of the people. That's what it says actually. Okay, did not support. That's opposite of what it is. Were too closely tied to transportation. Doesn't say that. Unwilling to issue long-term loans. Doesn't say that. Were too willing to lend credit widely. Doesn't say that. Which of the following statements best describes the function of the last sentence? Last sentence is, so this is the last sentence actually that we just saw, that historians, the exception such historians argue was in the South, the overwhelmingly agrarian nature of the economy generated outright opposition to banks which were seen as so and so. So it provides evidence tending to undermine the viewpoint of the scholars mentioned in line 5. Line 5 says the banks played a minor role in the nation's growing economy. So it doesn't undermine, actually it supports it. It's out. It resolves a conflict over the role of banks summarized in the first, doesn't resolve any conflict. It clarifies some of the reasons state legislatures began. No. It's not the reason. There is no reason given there why state legislators moved to. It's just mentioned that they granted more bank charters. That's it. It qualifies a claim made earlier in the passage about the impact of the banks on the American economy in the earlier 19th century. So earlier there is a claim here, if you see, that banks played a minor role. Okay, they were lending to only a narrow category of people, narrow category of industries. Okay, that's what it says actually. That's what it supports. Option E, it supports a claim made early in the passage about how the expansion of credit affected the economy. It doesn't. It's actually the otherwise. Okay, expansion of credit affected the economy in a good way, so it doesn't support it. It actually opposes it.